So there's this massive cash cliff that's supposedly looming in 2026. But what's really interesting is that when you do a deep forensic dive into company finances, it turns out that for some of the world's biggest companies, this isn't a risk at all, it's actually a strategic advantage. Let's dig in and see what's really hiding off the balance sheet.
It's a really important question, right? When you size up a company's health, you look at the usual stuff: debt, cash on hand, assets. But what if there was this giant, legally binding expense that just doesn't show up in those places? A hidden danger that could totally catch everyone off guard.
Well, this hidden risk has a name: unconditional purchase obligations. And here's the thing you absolutely have to understand about them. These are not optional. They are rock-solid, legally binding contracts for future payments. It's a guaranteed drain on their cash that you won't find listed with all the normal debt. And that, right there, is the cash cliff.
Okay, so if these obligations are kind of hidden in the footnotes, how in the world do you even find them? Well, it takes some serious digital detective work. We're not just guessing here. This comes from a full-blown forensic investigation into the company's own legal filings.
A team used some really powerful scanning technology to go through thousands and thousands of pages of corporate 10K filings. You know, those super dense, legally required reports companies have to put out every year. And their whole mission was to hunt down every single mention of these purchase obligations to figure out the exact cash commitments for 2026.
All right, so this table gives you a first look at the raw data. You've got the ticker symbols, you see the massive amount of cash or liquidity each company has, and then you see these 2026 commitments that were uncovered. Now that last column, LCR, that's the Liquidity Coverage Ratio. It's a simple score. If it's over 1.0, you've got enough cash to cover your bills. And as you can see, these numbers are just the start of a much, much deeper story.
So let's get to the good stuff. Let's see how this all plays out for some of the biggest, most watched companies on the entire planet. Because when you really look under the hood, each one has a completely different story to tell.
First up, Apple. You know, the conversation around Apple is always about iPhone sales, right? But this analysis shows that their real power, their true strength, lies somewhere else completely. Financially, they are just playing a different game than everyone else.
And this chart just says it all. I mean, look at the sheer scale of Apple's financial power. On one side, you have that little bar, that's their mandatory cash spend for 2026. And on the other, you have this colossal mountain of cash. The difference is just staggering.
Let me put it another way. Apple could pay every single one of its legally required off-balance sheet bills for 2026 and then turn around and do it 26 more times. That's not just a strong company. That's a financial fortress. We're talking about the kind of balance sheet you'd expect from a small country. Okay, next up, let's look at Tesla. The story here is just as surprising, but for a completely different reason. It's not just about how much cash they have, it's about where that cash has been hiding from the usual analysis. 56%. That's how much of Tesla's available cash was being totally missed by typical financial scans. So why? Was it some complex accounting trick? Nope. It was because it wasn't just sitting in an account labeled cash. It was classified as short-term investments, a little detail that only a deep, forensic dive like this would ever catch.
So, while Tesla is definitely safe from a cash perspective, their cash cliff is really unique. Their mandatory spending is all locked up in these huge contracts for battery materials. So their biggest promise isn't to a bank, it's to their suppliers, to secure the raw materials they absolutely need to keep growing.
Now NVIDIA's story is different all over again. I mean, these guys are at the absolute epicenter of the AI revolution, and their financial commitments are basically a massive strategic bet on staying right there at the top.
So their mandatory spend is a pretty big number, $5 billion. But what's that money for? It's not paying off debt. Almost all of it is for inventory purchase obligations. They're essentially prepaying the chip factories to guarantee they get to be first in line for future production. You have to see this for what it is. It's a high-stakes gamble to secure their dominance. They're using their financial strength not just to play it safe, but to actively try and corner the market on the single most important resource for the future of tech, those high-end AI chips.
And finally, we've got Amazon. Of all the companies we're looking at, they have the largest raw dollar commitment. And it's all being driven by the two massive engines at the heart of their empire: e-commerce and cloud computing.
At nearly $8 billion, their mandatory cash drain is huge. I mean, that's a ton of money. But then you look over at their war chest. With over $100 billion in total liquidity, they can cover those costs without even breaking a sweat. For a company like Amazon, huge spending commitments are just another Tuesday.
At the end of the day, this spending is just what fuels the Amazon machine. These obligations are for things like long-term content licensing for Prime Video and buying components for their AWS data centers. Yeah, it's a massive bill, but they have a massive wallet to match it.
Now, looking at these tech giants one by one is really interesting, but the real importance of all this, the so what, becomes crystal clear when you compare them to other companies out there. It really shows you a stark and, frankly, growing divide in the market.
And this comparison really tells the story of two completely different worlds emerging. On one side, you have a fortress like Apple, with so much cash it's basically already paid for its own survival in 2026. But on the other side, you have companies like Walmart, which this same analysis found has a liquidity ratio below 1.0. What does that mean? It means they are counting on future sales to pay for bills that are already legally due. That's a huge, fundamental difference in financial security.
So after all this digging into the 2026 cash cliff, what's the ultimate takeaway? What's the final verdict here? The conclusion is pretty undeniable. For these specific titans of technology, this so-called cash cliff isn't a threat. It's not even a worry. In fact, they've managed to turn it into a strategic advantage. By locking in their supply chains and managing these bills with their huge cash reserves, they haven't just prepared for 2026, they've already bought and paid for it.
And that leaves us with one final and pretty critical question to think about. These tech giants have built these incredible financial fortresses, prepaying for their future. But if they've already secured their own survival years in advance, who's left holding all the risk?